The sledgehammer hit the brick wall with a thunderous crack that echoed through the empty hangar. Dust exploded into the air, catching the harsh morning sunlight that streamed through the broken windows of Hangar 7 at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. It was September 15th, 2023, and construction foreman Tommy Martinez had no idea he was about to solve one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. "Something's not right here," Tommy muttered to his crew, pulling his safety goggles down as he examined the crumbling brickwork. The walls sounded hollow. The blueprints said this should be solid concrete, a load-bearing structure built in the 1960s. But this brick, it was different. Newer. Hastily constructed. He swung again. More brick fell away. And then he saw it, a gap, a darkness beyond. Something that shouldn't exist. Tommy grabbed his flashlight and shined it through the opening his sledgehammer had created. What he saw made his blood run cold. 2 pilot uniforms, folded neatly on the ground. Flight bags with the Transcontinental Airlines logo, faded and covered in decades of undisturbed dust. And behind them, slumped against the back wall of a hidden chamber that shouldn't exist, 2 skeletal figures still wearing watches that had stopped working 36 years ago. Tommy stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the concrete floor. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Call the police. Call them right now." But to understand what Tommy Martinez found that morning and why 2 men died in a sealed tomb behind that wall, we need to go back. Back to September 15th, 1987. Back to the last morning anyone ever saw Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer David Chen alive. This is their story. This is the mystery that haunted families for decades, puzzled FBI investigators, and was nearly buried forever beneath the rubble of a demolished building. This is the story of 2 airline pilots who vanished without a trace, until the day the wall finally came down. Welcome to Ultimate Crime Stories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that captivate and horrify us. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's begin at the beginning. September 15th, 1987, started like any other day at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Captain Michael Reynolds pulled his silver Buick into the employee parking lot at 4:18 a.m. Michael was 42 years old, a devoted father of 3, and a pilot with 15 years of impeccable service with Transcontinental Airlines. His colleagues described him as meticulous, professional, and unshakable in a crisis. In 15 years, he'd never missed a flight, never been late, never given anyone reason to question his dedication to safety and procedure. 8 minutes later, a red Honda Accord pulled into the space 3 rows over. First Officer David Chen, 31 years old, stepped out into the cool September morning, his flight bag slung over his shoulder. David was everything the airline looked for in a rising star: sharp, quick-thinking, personable with passengers and crew alike. He was engaged to be married to his college sweetheart, Jennifer Morrison, a kindergarten teacher who was already planning their spring wedding. David had his whole life ahead of him. The 2 men met at the employee entrance, exchanging the familiar morning greetings of colleagues who'd flown together dozens of times. Security footage shows them scanning their ID badges at 4:31 a.m., entering the terminal with coffee cups in hand, looking relaxed and ready for what should have been a routine flight. Transcontinental Flight 447 was scheduled to depart at 6 a.m. sharp. Chicago to Phoenix. A milk run, as pilots called it, straightforward, predictable, the kind of flight that experienced crews could fly in their sleep. The Boeing 737 assigned to the route had been serviced just 3 days earlier. Every system checked out perfectly. The weather forecast showed clear skies the entire route. 156 passengers had checked in, families heading to Arizona for vacations, business travelers catching early meetings, college students visiting home. Everything was perfect. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. The pre-flight briefing at 4:45 a.m. went smoothly. Michael and David reviewed the flight plan, discussed weather patterns, confirmed fuel loads, and chatted with the cabin crew about the upcoming day. Flight attendant Rebecca Walsh, who was working her 3rd flight with this crew, later told investigators that both pilots seemed relaxed and in good spirits. Captain Reynolds was telling jokes, she remembered. David was showing us pictures from his engagement party. There was nothing unusual, nothing that seemed off. They were just normal. At 4:47 a.m., security cameras captured Michael and David leaving the crew briefing room. This footage would later be analyzed frame by FBI experts, looking for any sign of distress, any indication of what was about to happen. They found nothing. The two pilots walked side by side, Michael gesturing with his hands as he talked, David nodding and smiling. They appeared to be discussing something routine, perhaps the flight plan, perhaps what they do on their layover in Phoenix. The camera shows them turning left down Corridor C, heading toward the gates and hangars. They walked past other airline employees, past a janitor mopping the floor, past a food service cart being wheeled toward a gate. They were just two more pilots in a sea of airline personnel starting another workday. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. At 5:15 a.m., Ground Crew Chief Martin Tucker went looking for the pilots. The aircraft was ready. Passengers were beginning to board, but there was no sign of the flight crew. Martin checked the crew lounge. Their personal bags were still there, but Michael and David were gone. He checked the break room, the bathrooms, even walked outside to see if they'd stepped out for some reason. Nothing. Martin radioed gate operations. "Have you seen Reynolds and Chen? They're supposed to be on 447. "Negative," came the response. "Haven't seen them since briefing." That's when the first flutter of worry began. In 15 years, Michael Reynolds had never been late to an aircraft. Not once. David Chen was equally reliable. Where were they? By 5:30 a.m., the worry had escalated to concern. The flight was supposed to push back in 30 minutes. Airport security was notified. Calls were made to both pilots' cell phones. This was 1987, so they carried the bulky mobile phones that were just becoming common. Both phones rang unanswered in their lockers in the crew lounge. Rebecca Walsh, the flight attendant, volunteered to check the hangars. Sometimes pilots like to do a last-minute walk-around inspection, especially on early morning flights. "I'll check Hangar 7, she said. "That's where our bird is parked." She walked across the tarmac in the growing light of dawn, her footsteps echoing in the vast space of Hangar 7. The Boeing 737 sat gleaming and ready, but there was no sign of the pilots. She called out their names. Her voice echoed back at her, hollow and alone. "Michael? David? You guys in here?" Silence. By 5:45 a.m., the situation had become critical. Passengers were seated, the aircraft was ready, but there was no flight crew. Airport security began a systematic search. They checked every gate, every restaurant, every bathroom, every closet, every possible location two pilots might be. Michael Reynolds' Buick sat in the parking lot, doors locked, nothing disturbed. David Chen's Honda was the same. Their cars hadn't moved. Their personal belongings remained in the crew lounge, wallets, keys, jackets, everything they'd left there when they went to check on the aircraft. At 6:30 a.m., Transcontinental Airlines made the painful decision to cancel Flight 447. 156 passengers were informed that due to a crew shortage, they would be rebooked on later flights. Many were angry, demanding explanations. None were given, because there were no explanations to give. Two pilots had simply vanished. By 7 a.m., the Chicago Police Department had been notified. By 8 a.m., the FBI had been called in. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a potential aviation security incident. Two commercial airline pilots disappearing on the morning of their flight raised terrifying questions. Terrorism? Defection? Kidnapping? In 1987, with the Cold War still very much alive, every possibility had to be considered. Special Agent Sarah Morrison was assigned as the lead investigator. A 15-year veteran of the FBI with a specialty in aviation security, Sarah had worked hijacking cases, bombing investigations, and countless security threats. But she'd never seen anything like this. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said, standing in the crew lounge at 9 a.m., looking at the two flight bags that sat exactly where Michael and David had left them. They checked in at 4:31. They attended the briefing at 4:45. They were last seen on security footage at 4:47, walking toward Hangar 7. And then they just disappeared. That's correct, Agent Morrison, the airport security chief confirmed. We've reviewed every camera, searched every location. It's like they walked into thin air. Sarah picked up Michael's flight bag. Inside was everything a pilot would need: charts, a calculator, reading glasses, a thermos of coffee that was now cold, a photograph of his 3 children. David's bag contained similar items, plus a small velvet box that made Sarah's heart sink. She opened it carefully. Inside was an engagement ring, a beautiful diamond that caught the fluorescent light. He was going to propose again? Sarah asked. No, he was getting it resized, one of the other pilots explained. Jennifer's ring kept slipping off. David was taking it to a jeweler during the Phoenix layover. He showed it to everyone at the briefing, said he'd surprise her when he got home tonight. Tonight. A tonight that David Chen would never see. Sarah set the ring box down carefully and looked at the assembled airport staff. I need security footage from every camera in this airport. I need personnel records for every employee who was working this morning. I need maintenance logs, access records, everything. And I need to know every single place those 2 pilots might have gone. The investigation was just beginning. But what Sarah didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the answers she sought were less than 500 feet away, behind a brick wall in Hangar 7, where 2 men were already dead or dying, sealed in darkness, their desperate attempts to escape unheard in the vast empty space of the hangar. The search intensified throughout that first day. K-9 units were brought in, trained dogs that could track a scent through the complex maze of terminals and hangars. But when the dogs reached Hangar 7, something strange happened. They became agitated, circling near the northwest corner of the building, barking and scratching at a wall. But their handlers saw nothing unusual. Just a brick wall, solid and unremarkable. Probably picking up rodents, one handler said, pulling his German shepherd away. Old buildings like this, there's always mice in the walls. If only they'd trusted the dogs. If only they'd torn down that wall. But they didn't. And the investigation moved on, leaving Michael and David behind that brick facade. Their story untold for 36 more years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to those first critical hours, when everyone still believed the pilots might be found alive. By noon on September 15, 1987, FBI Special Agent Sarah Morrison had transformed the Transcontinental Airlines crew lounge into a makeshift command center. Phones rang constantly. Officers moved in and out with reports and updates. Maps of the airport were spread across tables, marked with color-coded pins showing search grids and locations checked. Sarah stood before a growing wall of information. Photographs of Michael Reynolds and David Chen, their personnel files, timeline charts showing their last known movements, and a growing list of questions that had no answers. Let's go through this again, Sarah said to her assembled team. What do we actually know? Agent Marcus Webb, her partner on the case, consulted his notepad. Both pilots checked in at 4:31 a.m. Both attended the mandatory pre-flight briefing at 4:45. Last confirmed visual sighting was security camera footage at 4:47 a.m., showing them walking down corridor C toward the hangar areas. After that, nothing. What about the passengers? Any connections there? We've run background checks on all 156 passengers booked on Flight 447. Nothing unusual. Families, business travelers, students. No red flags, no one with criminal records, no one connected to any terrorist organizations or hostile governments. Sarah tapped her pen against her teeth, thinking, what about the pilots themselves? Any financial problems? Gambling debts? Affairs? Anything that might make them want to run? Agent Webb shook his head. Captain Reynolds is squeaky clean. Been with Transcontinental for 15 years. Married to his high school sweetheart, Linda. 3 kids, 2 in elementary school, 1 in high school. Lives in a modest house in Arlington Heights. Coaches his son's little league team. Goes to church every Sunday. His financial records show no irregularities. No unexplained deposits or withdrawals. No secret accounts. The man is exactly what he appears to be, a dedicated pilot and family man. And First Officer Chen? Also clean. David's been with the airline for 6 years. Engaged to Jennifer Morrison, they're planning a spring wedding. No financial problems, no secrets that we can find. His colleagues all say the same thing. He's professional, reliable, friendly. No one has a bad word to say about either pilot. Sarah frowned. People don't just disappear without reason. There's always something. Unless someone took them, Agent Webb suggested quietly. That was the theory that terrified everyone. Because if someone had kidnapped 2 commercial airline pilots on the morning of their flight, the implications were staggering. Was this about terrorism? Espionage? In 1987, the Cold War was entering its final years, but tensions still ran high. Could a foreign government have targeted these pilots for some reason? We need to focus on Hangar 7, Sarah decided. That's where the trail ends. If they're anywhere, they're there. Hangar 7 was a massive structure, built in 1963 as part of O'Hare's expansion. It could house 3 commercial aircraft simultaneously and served as both a parking area and a maintenance facility for transcontinental airlines. The building was a labyrinth of offices, storage rooms, equipment bays, and work areas spread across 60,000 square feet. At 2 p.m., Sarah led a team of 20 FBI agents and Chicago police officers into Hangar 7 for what would be the first of many exhaustive searches. They started with the obvious places: offices, break rooms, bathrooms. Then they moved to the less obvious: storage closets, equipment lockers, the crawl spaces above the ceiling tiles. Check everything, Sarah instructed. I want eyes on every square inch of this building. Hours passed. The search continued into the evening. Agents climbed into aircraft wheel wells, opened every storage container, searched every possible hiding place. The maintenance pit beneath the hangar floor was drained and searched. The roof was checked. Even the dumpsters outside were emptied and examined. Nothing. At 6 p.m., Sarah stood in the center of the hangar, slowly turning in a circle, studying the massive space. They were here, she said quietly. The security footage shows them heading this direction. They never came back out. They have to be here. Unless there's another exit we don't know about, Agent Webb suggested. They spent another 2 hours mapping every possible exit from the hangar. There were 4 main doors: the massive hangar bay doors, a personnel entrance on the east side, a loading dock on the south side, and an emergency exit on the north side. All were covered by security cameras. None showed Michael and David leaving. What about underground? Sarah asked. Storm drains, utility tunnels? The airport maintenance chief, a gruff man named Robert Walsh, was called in to provide blueprints. At 53 years old, Walsh had worked at O'Hare for over 25 years. He knew every building, every pipe, every electrical conduit. If there was a hidden passage, he would know about it. There's a storm drain system, Walsh confirmed, spreading blueprints across a work table. But it's all graded and locked. Has been for years, ever since 9/11. Well, before that even. Security concern. The only access points are locked and alarmed. Show us anyway, Sarah insisted. Walsh led them to 3 different access points within Hangar 7. All were locked, just as he'd said. All were covered in undisturbed dust. None had been opened in months, possibly years. What about this? Agent Webb asked, pointing to a section of the hangar's northwest wall. The brick looked different there, newer somehow, a slightly different shade than the surrounding structure. Walsh glanced at it dismissively. Oh, that. We did some structural reinforcement there about 2 weeks ago. Had some concerns about load-bearing capacity. Brought in a contractor. They shored up the wall with additional brick and concrete. Standard maintenance. Can we see behind it? Walsh looked annoyed. Behind it? It's solid. We built it solid. There's nothing behind it but more brick and then the original exterior wall. Sarah studied the wall, something nagging at her instincts. When exactly was this work done? Walsh consulted a clipboard he'd brought with him. Started on September 1st, finished on September 3rd. About 12 days ago. Who did the work? I supervised it myself, along with 2 contractors from Midwest Construction Services. I can get you their names if you want. I want, Sarah said firmly. But even as she requested the information, the moment of suspicion passed. Thermal imaging equipment was brought in and aimed at the wall. The readings showed solid mass, brick, concrete, steel reinforcement. No cavities, no hollow spaces, no place 2 grown men could be hidden. It's solid, the technician confirmed. No voids, no spaces. Just wall. Sarah nodded slowly, accepting the assessment but filing away her unease. Years later, she would remember this moment with bitter regret. The answer had been right there, 5 feet away, behind that brick wall. But the thermal imaging had lied, or rather, had shown them exactly what they'd expected to see, missing the carefully constructed double wall that hid a chamber just wide enough for 2 men. As darkness fell on that first day, the search of Hangar 7 was called off. Michael Reynolds and David Chen remained missing. And behind the brick wall, if they were still alive, they were running out of air, running out of hope, and running out of time. The next morning, September 16th, brought new theories and new directions for the investigation. The media had gotten hold of the story, and it was national news. Pilots vanish before flight, screamed the headlines. The story had everything: mystery, aviation, the possibility of terrorism or espionage. Sarah's phone rang at 6 a.m. It was FBI Director Thomas Ashford, calling from Washington. "Sarah, I need you to consider all possibilities here," Ashford said carefully. "Is there any chance these pilots defected?" Defected? To where? Soviet Union? Cuba? Anywhere. Maybe they had access to classified information about airline security. Maybe they were compromised. Sarah felt her frustration rising. "Sir, these men have no access to classified information. They fly commercial routes. They're not military pilots. And both of them have families, lives, roots here. Defection makes no sense. Nevertheless, explore it. We're getting pressure from State Department. They want answers." And so the investigation expanded into increasingly unlikely territories. Intelligence agencies were contacted. International databases were searched. Tips began pouring in. Someone thought they saw the pilots at a bus station in Detroit, at a train station in New York, at a border crossing into Canada. Every tip was investigated. Every lead went nowhere. Meanwhile, Sarah kept returning to Hangar 7. Something about that building bothered her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was there, somewhere in that vast space. On September 18th, 3 days after the disappearance, she interviewed Robert Walsh again. The maintenance chief sat across from her in a small office, looking tired and irritated. "Mr. Walsh, walk me through your movements on the morning of September 15th, Sarah requested. Walsh sighed. "I've already told you this twice." "Tell me again." "Fine. I got to the airport at 5 a.m. I always start early. I went to my office in Hangar 3, reviewed the maintenance schedule for the day, had some coffee. Around 6 a.m., I heard about the missing pilots. I came over to Hangar 7 to help with the search." "Did you see the pilots at all that morning?" "No. I was in Hangar 3. Different building entirely." "Did you know them?" "I knew who they were." "O'Hare isn't that big. You see the same faces. But I didn't know them personally." "Tell me about the wall reinforcement you did in Hangar 7. Walsh's jaw tightened slightly. "What about it? Why did it need reinforcement?" "We noticed some stress cracks. Not dangerous, but concerning. We decided to shore it up before it became a problem. Standard preventive maintenance." "Who made that decision?" "I did. It's my job to maintain these facilities." "And the work was completed on September 3rd? "That's correct." "Have you been back to Hangar 7 since then?" "Before the 15th, I mean." Walsh hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Sure, I'm in and out of all the hangars regularly. Can't tell you specific dates." Sarah made notes, her instincts prickling. There was something in Walsh's demeanor, a tension that seemed more than just irritation at repeated questioning. But she had no evidence, no reason to push harder. "Are you going to polygraph me?" Walsh asked suddenly. "Would you be willing to take one? If it'll get you people off my back, sure." The polygraph was administered 2 days later. The results were inconclusive, not a pass, but not a fail either. Walsh showed stress responses to several questions, but the examiner couldn't determine if it was because he was lying or simply because he was anxious about being investigated. Inconclusive doesn't mean guilty, Agent Webb pointed out. It doesn't mean innocent either, Sarah countered. But without evidence, without any concrete reason to suspect Walsh beyond a gut feeling and some unclear polygraph readings, the investigation had to move on. Other persons of interest emerged. Victor Crane, a senior executive with Transcontinental Airlines, came under scrutiny when investigators discovered the airline was facing serious financial difficulties. The company was losing money, facing increased competition from newer airlines. Could the disappearance of 2 pilots be connected to some insurance scheme? It doesn't make sense, Sarah argued in a team meeting. Even if the airline wanted to claim insurance money for dead pilots, which is insane, why would they make them disappear? Why not stage an accident? Maybe it wasn't planned, Agent Webb suggested. Maybe something went wrong. But investigation into Victor Crane's finances and movements showed nothing suspicious. He'd been in a meeting with airline executives at the time of the disappearance, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. He had no opportunity to be involved directly. Then there was the mysterious figure caught on grainy security footage near Hangar 7 at 4:50 a.m. on the morning of the disappearance. The camera angle was poor, the lighting worse, and the figure was too far away and too obscure to identify. It could have been a maintenance worker. It could have been a pilot. It could have been anyone. Enhancement of the footage revealed nothing useful. The figure remained a shadow, a ghost, a tantalizing possibility that led nowhere. September became October. October became November. The investigation consumed thousands of man-hours. FBI agents interviewed over 200 people. Security footage from every camera in O'Hare was reviewed multiple times. Financial records, phone records, credit card statements, everything was examined and re-examined. The families of the missing pilots were devastated. Linda Reynolds, Michael's wife, held a tearful press conference, begging for information. "Please," she sobbed, her 3 children beside her. "If you know anything about what happened to my husband, please come forward. Our children need their father. I need my husband. Please, just tell us what happened." Jennifer Morrison, David's fiancée, was equally distraught. "David and I were supposed to get married next spring," she told reporters, holding up the engagement photo of her and David, both of them smiling and happy. "We had our whole lives planned. And now, I just want to know what happened to him. That's all. I just want to know." But there were no answers to give them. The investigation was stalling. Leads dried up. Tips stopped coming in. The media moved on to other stories. And slowly, inevitably, the case began to go cold. In March of 1988, 6 months after the disappearance, the FBI officially reduced the number of agents assigned to the case. Sarah Morrison was reassigned to other investigations, though she kept the Reynolds-Chen case file on her desk, unable to let it go completely. "We'll keep it open," her supervisor assured her. "Any new leads come in, we'll pursue them. But Sarah, we've done everything we can. Sometimes people just vanish, and we never find out why." But Sarah couldn't accept that. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be an answer. 2 men don't just disappear into thin air. There had to be evidence, a witness, something that would crack the case open. She didn't know that the evidence she sought was already there, had been there all along, locked behind a brick wall that would stay sealed for 36 years. She didn't know that by the time that wall came down, everyone involved would be dead or dying, and justice would come far too late. But that time was still decades away. For now, let's continue with the cold case years, the conspiracy theories, and the families who never stopped searching. By 1990, the case of the missing pilots had officially gone cold. The FBI closed the active investigation, though the files remained open, technically unsolved. Michael Reynolds and David Chen were legally declared dead in 1992, after the required 7 years of absence. Their families held memorial services, trying to find some closure without bodies, without answers, without knowing what had really happened on that September morning. Linda Reynolds never remarried. She raised their 3 children alone, working as a nurse to support the family. The kids grew up without their father, with only photographs and fading memories to remember him by. Every September 15th, Linda would take the children to church and light candles in Michael's memory. "Your father was a good man," she would tell them. "Whatever happened to him, always remember that he was a good man who loved you very much." Jennifer Morrison eventually moved away from Chicago, unable to bear the memories. She settled in Portland, Oregon, and eventually did marry, though she kept a photograph of David Chen on her nightstand for the rest of her life. "He was my first love," she would explain to her husband, who understood and never asked her to remove it. "A part of my heart will always belong to him, to the life we should have had." But while the official investigation had closed, the case never truly died. It lived on in conspiracy theories, in amateur detective forums, in late-night discussions among aviation enthusiasts who couldn't let the mystery go. The theories ranged from plausible to absurd. Some believed the pilots had been killed by drug cartels. O'Hare was a major hub, perfect for smuggling operations, and perhaps the pilots had seen something they shouldn't have. Others insisted it was government-related, that the pilots had been recruited for some black ops program or had been eliminated because they knew too much about something classified. The more outlandish theories involved alien abduction. The late 1980s and 1990s were the height of UFO mania in America, and some people insisted that the pilots had been taken aboard a spacecraft. There was even a theory that the pilots had been recruited by the Witness Protection Program and were living under assumed identities somewhere in rural Montana. True crime shows picked up the story periodically. Unsolved Mysteries featured the case in 1993. America's Most Wanted did a segment in 1996, hoping someone, somewhere, might have information. Each broadcast brought a new flood of tips. Someone thought they'd seen Michael Reynolds working at a gas station in New Mexico. Someone swore David Chen was living in a trailer park in Florida. Every tip was investigated. Every tip led nowhere. But there was one tip that should have been taken more seriously. In November of 1995, 8 years after the disappearance, the Chicago FBI field office received an anonymous phone call. The desk agent who took the call later remembered it clearly because the caller's voice was shaking, frightened, desperate. "You need to look behind the wall," the caller said. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself and—" "Hangar 7, the northwest wall. You need to look behind it. That's where they are. That's where they've been all along." "Who is this? How do you know?" But the line went dead. The call was traced to a payphone at a truck stop on Interstate 90, 40 miles outside of Chicago. By the time investigators reached the location, whoever had made the call was long gone. The tip was logged and filed. A notation was made in the case file. But the tip was vague, anonymous, and the wall in question had already been thoroughly investigated back in 1987. Thermal imaging had shown nothing. There was no reason to tear down a structural wall based on an anonymous phone call from 8 years after the fact. Sarah Morrison, now retired from the FBI and working as a private security consultant, heard about the tip and felt that old familiar frustration return. She'd always believed the answer was in Hangar 7. She'd always felt they'd missed something. But she was no longer on the case, no longer had the authority to pursue it. All she could do was wonder and remember and regret. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Hangar 7 continued to operate, though its use declined as Transcontinental Airlines restructured and eventually merged with another carrier. The maintenance operations were gradually moved to newer, more modern facilities. The hangar became primarily a storage space, then barely used at all. Employees who worked in Hangar 7 sometimes reported strange feelings about the place. Nothing dramatic, nothing supernatural, just an unease, a sense that something wasn't right about the northwest corner of the building. "I don't like being over there," one mechanic told a colleague. "Gives me the creeps." But these feelings were dismissed as imagination, as the power of suggestion from knowing about the missing pilots. The wall remained, painted over multiple times as the years passed, eventually forgotten. People walked past it every day, never knowing that just a few feet behind those bricks were the answers everyone had been seeking. The skeletal remains of two men, still wearing their watches, still holding the evidence that would eventually unravel the entire conspiracy. In 2005, Robert Walsh retired from his position as maintenance chief at O'Hare. He'd worked at the airport for 42 years, seen it grow and change, watched entire eras of aviation come and go. His retirement party was well attended. His colleagues praised his dedication and expertise. He received a gold watch and a plaque thanking him for his service. No one noticed how Walsh avoided looking at Hangar 7 during the party. No one saw him pause as he walked past it one final time, his hand touching the brick wall briefly before he climbed into his car and drove away, leaving behind the secret he'd carried for 18 years. Victor Crane, the Transcontinental Airlines executive who'd been investigated back in 1987, also retired around this time, moving to a luxury condo in Florida. He'd done well for himself over the years, risen high in the corporate world, accumulated wealth and respect. But those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after the disappearance of the pilots. He drank too much. He had nightmares. He would sometimes mutter things in his sleep that his wife couldn't quite make out. The years rolled on. 2010, 2015, 2020, Chicago continued to grow and change. O'Hare expanded, modernized, adapted to new security requirements and new technologies. The events of 9/11 transformed aviation security, making the disappearance of two pilots seem almost quaint by comparison. How could two men vanish when every aspect of airport security had now been militarized? By 2018, Hangar 7 was slated for demolition. The building was old, outdated, no longer needed in the modernized airport operations. The property was valuable, and the airport authority had plans for a new terminal expansion that would occupy the space. But the demolition was delayed, first by paperwork, then by environmental reviews, then by budget concerns, then by the COVID-19 pandemic. The hangar sat empty, slowly deteriorating, its windows broken by vandals, its interior stripped of anything valuable, becoming a forgotten relic of aviation history. Urban explorers sometimes broke into the abandoned building, taking photographs of the decaying structure for their Instagram feeds. They walked through the same spaces where Michael Reynolds and David Chen had walked their last steps. They photographed the graffitied walls, the rusted equipment, the holes in the roof where rain came through. None of them knew they were just feet away from one of aviation's greatest mysteries. In December of 2019, Robert Walsh was dying. At 88 years old, he'd been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him weeks, maybe a month. He lay in his bed at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His children and grandchildren gathered around him, saying their goodbyes. And, according to the night shift nurse who was there, Walsh tried to say something in his final hours. His daughter leaned close, trying to understand the words he was struggling to form. "The wall," Walsh whispered. "Hangar, the wall. I should have." "What about a wall, Dad?" his daughter asked gently. "What are you trying to say?" But Walsh's eyes closed. His breathing became labored. And whatever confession he'd been trying to make remained unspoken. He died 3 hours later, taking his secret to the grave, or so he thought. His daughter mentioned her father's strange final words to the nurse, who mentioned it to a doctor, who mentioned it to someone else. The story filtered through the hospital staff, eventually reaching a young intern who'd grown up fascinated by the case of the missing pilots. The intern did some research, found that Walsh had been the maintenance chief at O'Hare, that he'd been questioned about the disappearance back in 1987. The intern called the FBI tip line, but the case was 32 years old at that point. The FBI agent who took the call made a note in the file, but there was no active investigation to pursue it. Walsh was dead. Whatever he'd been trying to say was lost forever. Except it wasn't. Because the wall was still there, still holding its terrible secret. And in just a few more years, it would finally tell its story. By September of 2023, 36 years to the day after Michael Reynolds and David Chen walked into Hangar 7 and never came back out, the demolition of the old hangar was finally approved and scheduled. A construction company called Midwest Demolition Services won the contract. They would strip the building of any remaining materials that could be salvaged, then bring in the heavy equipment to tear the structure down. The foreman assigned to the project was Tommy Martinez, 42 years old, a second-generation construction worker who'd never heard of the missing pilots, didn't know the building's dark history. To him, Hangar 7 was just another demolition job, another old building to be torn down and forgotten. He had no idea he was about to make history. No idea that his sledgehammer would finally answer questions that had haunted families for 36 years. No idea that the secret behind the wall was about to be revealed at last. But that moment is coming. The truth is about to emerge. Let's go back to that September morning in 2023 and see what Tommy Martinez found when the wall finally came down. September 15th, 2023. Exactly 36 years after the disappearance. Tommy Martinez didn't believe in fate or cosmic coincidence, but later, he would wonder about the timing. Of all the days his crew could have started working on that particular wall, it happened to be the anniversary. To the day. To the hour. The morning started normally enough. Tommy's crew of 5 men arrived at Hangar 7 at 7 a.m., ready to begin the systematic stripping of the building. The plan was to remove anything of value, copper wiring, steel beams, aluminum fixtures, before the demolition equipment arrived next week. Let's start with the northwest section, Tommy instructed. Interior walls first, work our way out. The northwest corner of Hangar 7 was darker than the rest of the building. More of the windows were broken here, less light got in. The floor was covered in debris, broken tiles, pieces of ceiling panels, decades of accumulated dust and dirt. The crew swept the area clear and began examining the walls. "This one's weird," said Carlos Mendez, one of Tommy's longtime crew members. He was tapping on a section of brick wall with a hammer, listening to the sound. "Doesn't sound the same as the others." Tommy came over and tapped it himself. Carlos was right. Most of the walls in the hangar had a solid, dense sound when struck. But this section sounded different. Slightly hollow. Echoey. "Check the blueprints," Tommy instructed. They spread the architectural drawings across a work table. According to the 1963 original plans, this should be a solid exterior wall. But there were notations added later in different ink showing structural reinforcement, September 1987. "Reinforcement usually means they added to the wall, made it thicker," Carlos said. "But this sounds hollow." Tommy frowned. Something wasn't right. He'd been in construction for 20 years, had torn down dozens of buildings. You developed an instinct for these things. And his instincts were telling him that this wall was not what it appeared to be. "Let's open it up," he decided. Carlos picked up a sledgehammer. "You sure? This might be load-bearing. We're tearing the whole building down next week anyway. Let's see what's behind there." The first strike of the sledgehammer sent cracks spider webbing through the brick. It crumbled more easily than it should have, the mortar weak and brittle. Tommy stepped closer, examining the exposed brick behind the cracked facade. "This is newer brick," he said. "This isn't original to the building." Another strike. More brick fell away. And then Carlos's sledgehammer punched through entirely, creating a small hole in the wall. Air rushed out of the opening, stale and dead, air that hadn't moved in 36 years. Tommy grabbed his flashlight and shined it through the hole. At first, he couldn't process what he was seeing. The beam of light illuminated a small chamber, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. The floor was concrete. The walls were the original brick from the 1960s building. And against the far wall. "Oh my God," Tommy whispered. "Carlos, call 911. Right now." "What? What is it?" "Just call them. Tell them we found human remains." Carlos's face went pale. He fumbled for his phone while Tommy continued to shine his light through the opening, his hands shaking. 2 figures slumped against the back wall. Even after 36 years, Tommy could see they'd once been people. The clothing had survived. Uniforms of some kind, dark navy blue with patches on the shoulders. Flight bags sat beside the bodies. And on the ground in front of them, Scattered bones that had once been hands, positioned as if the people had been desperately clawing at the wall. The other crew members gathered around, peering through the hole, their voices hushed and horrified. Are those pilot uniforms?" someone asked. Tommy looked closer at the patches on the shoulders. Wings. Captain's wings. First officer's wings. And then he saw the name tags, faded but still legible in his flashlight beam. Reynolds? Chen. "Oh Jesus," Tommy breathed. "These are the missing pilots. The ones from 1987. They were here the whole time. They were right here." The Chicago Police Department arrived within 15 minutes. The officers took one look through the hole in the wall and immediately cordoned off the entire hangar. The FBI was called. The Cook County Medical Examiner was called. By noon, Hangar 7 was swarming with investigators, crime scene technicians, and federal agents. Special Agent Jennifer Wu, the current head of the FBI's Chicago field office, stood in front of the partially demolished wall, trying to wrap her mind around what she was seeing. "They've been here for 36 years, she said to Tommy Martinez. "In this wall?" "That's what it looks like," Tommy confirmed. "Someone bricked them in. Sealed them in alive, probably." The crime scene team worked carefully to remove the rest of the wall without disturbing the chamber behind it. As the bricks came down, the full horror of the scene was revealed. The small chamber was a tomb. There was no other word for it. The two skeletal figures were positioned against the back wall, slumped over as if they'd been sitting and eventually collapsed as death took them. Their flight bags were beside them, the contents spilled out, flight manuals, personal items, photographs. And there were marks on the inside of the brick wall. Deep scratches, gouges in the mortar, places where fingernails had clawed desperately at the brick. The men had tried to escape. They tried to break through. They died trying. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the medical examiner, entered the chamber carefully, her camera documenting every detail. She'd been doing this job for 15 years, had seen every kind of death imaginable. But this was different. This was calculated. This was murder in its coldest form. "Initial assessment," Dr. Hernandez said into her recorder. "Two adult male skeletons, positioned against the south wall of a sealed chamber approximately 8 by 10 feet. Clothing consistent with commercial airline pilot uniforms, 1980s era. Visible trauma to the hands and fingers, consistent with desperate attempts to break through the brick wall. Cause of death likely asphyxiation due to oxygen deprivation in the sealed space. Time since death, approximately 35 to 40 years based on decomposition and clothing preservation." She carefully examined the bodies, taking photographs, making notes. And then she found something that made her pause. In the pocket of the first officer's uniform jacket, there was a piece of paper, folded carefully, protected from the elements by the sealed chamber. "Agent Wu," Dr. Hernandez called out. "You need to see this." Jennifer Wu climbed carefully into the chamber, stepping around the evidence markers that had been placed throughout the space. Dr. Hernandez handed her a sealed evidence bag containing the folded paper. "I haven't opened it," Dr. Hernandez explained. "But there's writing visible through the fold. It looks like a note." Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she carefully opened the evidence bag and unfolded the paper. It was a page torn from a flight manual, the blank space on the back covered in pencil writing. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, the words of a man who knew he was dying. Jennifer read it aloud for the other investigators to hear. "To whoever find this, my name is David Chen, first officer with Transcontinental Airlines. With me is Captain Michael Reynolds. It is approximately 6 a.m. on September 15th, 1987. We have been trapped in this room for over an hour. We came to Hangar 7 to inspect our aircraft before our 6 a.m. flight. When we entered the hangar, we saw Robert Walsh, the maintenance chief, and Victor Crane, the senior VP of operations, arguing about something. We heard Crane say, 'The audit will find everything.' Walsh saw us. He had a gun. He forced us into this room at gunpoint. Crane helped him. They said we heard too much, that we couldn't be allowed to jeopardize everything. They sealed us in. We've been trying to break through the bricks, but we can't. The air is getting thin. Michael says to tell his wife Linda and his children that he loves them. I want Jennifer to know that I love her, that I'm sorry we won't get married. I'm sorry this is how it ends. Someone needs to investigate Crane and Walsh. They're embezzling from the airline. That's what we heard them arguing about. That's why they're killing us. Please tell our families what happened. Please don't let them get away with this. David Chen, September 15, 1987, approximately 7:30 a.m. Silence fell over the crime scene. Every investigator, every technician, every officer stood frozen, processing what they just heard. For 36 years, this note had waited in the darkness. For 36 years, David Chen's final message had gone unread, his desperate plea for justice unheard. Robert Walsh, Jennifer Wu said quietly. He was questioned back in 1987. He's the one who did the wall reinforcement just days before the pilots disappeared. He built this tomb, and then he helped search for the men he'd murdered. He's dead. One of the older FBI agents spoke up. Walsh died in 2019. I remember because someone called in a tip about him, something about a deathbed confession that never quite happened. And Victor Crane? I'll check. The agent pulled out his phone, began making calls. Jennifer looked back at the note in her hands, at David Chen's final words written in shaking pencil on a page torn from a flight manual. She thought about the families who'd waited 36 years for answers. She thought about Linda Reynolds raising 3 children alone, about Jennifer Morrison moving across the country to escape her grief. She thought about the investigators in 1987 who'd searched so desperately and come so close to the truth, only to miss it by a few feet of brick. Agent Wu, the FBI agent called out, phone still pressed to his ear. Victor Crane is still alive, 89 years old, living in a retirement facility in Boca Raton, Florida. I'm getting local agents mobilized now. Jennifer nodded slowly. Get me everything on the 1987 investigation. Every file, every interview, every piece of evidence. And get me the financial records for Transcontinental Airlines from that period. David Chen's note mentioned embezzlement. Let's find out what they were hiding, what they killed to protect. As the investigation kicked into high gear, as agents scrambled to gather evidence and build a case, the medical examiner continued her careful work. She documented every detail of the crime scene, every piece of evidence that told the story of 2 men's final hours. Near Captain Reynolds, she found a thermos that had once contained coffee, now just dust and dried residue. She found a photograph remarkably preserved, showing 3 children, Reynolds' kids, who were now adults, who'd grown up without their father. She found First Officer Chen's engagement ring, the diamond still sparkling in the harsh crime scene lights, the ring that was supposed to be resized in Phoenix, the ring that Jennifer Morrison never got to wear. And throughout the chamber, she documented the scratch marks, the desperate gouges in the brick, the evidence of 2 men's final desperate hours, as the oxygen slowly ran out and darkness closed in around them. The arrest of Victor Crane made national headlines. 89 years old, confined to a wheelchair, suffering from advanced dementia. He hardly looked like a killer. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the FBI wasn't about to let age or infirmity stand in the way of justice. The agents who arrested him at the Sunrise Senior Living Facility in Boca Raton found him in his room, watching television, seemingly unaware of the storm that was about to break over him. When they read him his rights and told him he was being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, he simply stared at them blankly. I don't know what you're talking about, Crane said, his voice weak and shaky. There must be some mistake. But back in Chicago, there was no mistake. The investigation that reopened after the discovery in Hangar 7 had uncovered a web of financial fraud that stretched back decades. Transcontinental Airlines in the late 1980s had been hemorrhaging money, facing bankruptcy, on the verge of collapse. Victor Crane, as the senior VP of operations, had access to all the financial systems, and he'd been using that access to embezzle millions of dollars over a period of years. Robert Walsh, the maintenance chief, had been his accomplice. Walsh had discovered the embezzlement scheme by accident, found discrepancies in fuel logs, noticed that maintenance budgets didn't match actual expenditures, realized that someone was siphoning money out of the airline, and instead of reporting it, he'd wanted in on the action. for a cut of the profits, Walsh had kept quiet and helped Crane cover his tracks. The scheme had worked perfectly for years. Small amounts, carefully hidden in accounting records, difficult to trace. By 1987, Crane and Walsh had stolen over $8 million, a fortune, especially by 1980 standards. They'd funneled the money into offshore accounts, set themselves up for comfortable retirements. And then Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer David Chen had walked into Hangar 7 at the wrong time. Financial investigators pieced together what had likely happened that morning. Reynolds had noticed irregularities in fuel logs during pre-flight checks in the weeks before September 15th. He'd mentioned it to Chen, and the two pilots had started quietly investigating. They'd planned to report their findings to airline management after their Phoenix flight. But on the morning of September 15th, they'd overheard Crane and Walsh arguing about the upcoming FAA audit that was scheduled for later that month. The audit would have uncovered everything. The scheme was about to collapse. And when the pilots heard enough to realize what was happening, Walsh and Crane made a terrible decision. They couldn't let the pilots report what they'd heard. They couldn't let them get on that airplane and potentially tell someone what they'd discovered. So Walsh, who always carried a gun for security, had pulled it out. And together, he and Crane had forced the pilots into the small storage room that would become their tomb. "We're sorry," Walsh had apparently said, according to what Crane would later admit in a moment of confused lucidity during questioning. "But we can't let you ruin this. We've come too far." And then they'd sealed the wall, brick by brick, working frantically before the airport became too busy, before anyone noticed. The chamber they created was airtight. The pilots might have had a few hours of oxygen. They would have tried desperately to escape, clawing at the bricks until their fingers bled, shouting for help that never came. And eventually, the air ran out. The darkness became permanent. And two men who'd simply gone to check on their airplane died in a tomb made of brick and greed. The trial of Victor Crane was mercifully swift. His lawyers tried to argue that he was too ill to stand trial, that his dementia made him incompetent. But psychiatric evaluations showed that while his memory was deteriorating, he understood the charges against him and could assist in his own defense. The evidence was presented methodically. David Chen's final note, authenticated by handwriting experts. Financial records showing the embezzlement scheme. Testimony from Transcontinental Airlines employees who remembered Crane's unusual behavior in the weeks after the disappearance. The sealed chamber itself, photographed in excruciating detail, showing the desperate scratch marks on the bricks. Linda Reynolds attended every day of the trial, now 67 years old, her hair gray, her face lined with decades of grief and waiting. She sat in the front row and stared at Victor Crane with an expression that was neither hatred nor forgiveness, simply a desperate need for acknowledgement, for him to finally admit what he'd done. On the fourth day of the trial, during a moment when his lawyer was questioning a witness, Crane suddenly spoke up, his voice cutting across the courtroom. "I didn't mean for them to die," he said, tears running down his weathered face. "I never meant, we just needed time. We were going to let them out, after we'd moved the money, But Bob said it was too risky. He said they'd seen too much. He said we had to." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Crane's lawyers tried to quiet him, but he kept talking, the words spilling out like poison that had been trapped inside for 36 years. "I dream about them," Crane whispered. "Every night for 36 years, I dream about them in that room. I hear them screaming. I hear them trying to break through the wall. I hear them dying. And I can't make it stop." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of embezzlement. Guilty of everything. Victor Crane was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 89 years old, life didn't mean much time, but it meant he would die in prison, die with the weight of his crimes finally acknowledged and punished. He died 8 months later in the prison medical facility, a heart attack in his sleep. Some people said it was mercy. Others said it was too easy, that he deserved to suffer more for what he'd done. Linda Reynolds, when asked for comment, simply said, "He's dead. Michael is still dead. Nothing changes that. But at least now we know the truth." Jennifer Morrison, David Chen's former fiancée, had moved back to Chicago for the trial. She was 67 years old now, married for 25 years to a good man who'd helped her heal from her grief. But when they finally held a proper funeral for David, when they finally buried his remains with full honors, Jennifer stood at the graveside and placed her old engagement ring, the one David had been taking to be resized, the one found in that terrible chamber, on top of his casket. "I'm sorry it took so long," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to wait 36 years. But you can rest now. You can finally rest." The three children of Michael Reynolds, now adults, now with children of their own, held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds. Pilots from every airline, current and retired, came to honor the two men who'd been murdered simply for doing what was right. The memorial was held at O'Hare Airport in a special ceremony that included a moment of silence at 4:47 a.m., the exact time that Michael and David had last been seen on security footage, walking toward their deaths. O'Hare International Airport renamed Terminal 3 the Reynolds Chen Memorial Terminal. A plaque was installed telling their story, honoring their sacrifice. It reads, "In memory of Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer David Chen, who died on September 15, 1987. Two dedicated pilots, two good men, who lost their lives because they stood for integrity and truth. May their sacrifice remind us that the price of silence is sometimes measured in lives, and that justice, though delayed, will always find its way to light. Blue skies and tailwinds, gentlemen. Your watch is ended." The site of Hangar 7 was not developed as planned. Instead, after the trial concluded, it was turned into a memorial park. The exact spot where the wall stood, where the tomb was discovered, is marked by a simple stone monument. Families of airline employees often visit, leaving flowers, leaving notes, standing in quiet contemplation of two men who simply went to work one morning and never came home. The investigation into Transcontinental Airlines' embezzlement scheme uncovered that Crane and Walsh had stolen over $12 million across a decade. Much of the money was eventually recovered from offshore accounts and returned to the airline, or rather, to its successor companies, as Transcontinental itself had long since been absorbed through mergers and acquisitions. Special Agent Sarah Morrison, the FBI investigator who'd led the original search in 1987, was 82 years old when the bodies were finally found. She'd retired years earlier, lived quietly in a suburb of Chicago, had long since made peace with the case that haunted her career. When FBI agent Jennifer Wu came to her house to tell her about the discovery, Sarah sat down heavily in her chair and wept. "I knew," she said through her tears. "I knew they were in that hangar. I knew something was wrong with that wall. But I didn't push hard enough. I didn't. God, if I just torn down that wall in 1987, we might have. You couldn't have known," Jennifer said gently. The thermal imaging showed solid mass. Every indication said the wall was exactly what it appeared to be. You did everything you could. But Sarah shook her head. "Their families waited 36 years for answers because I didn't trust my instincts. Because I accepted the evidence at face value. I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." She died 2 years later, at the age of 84. At her funeral, Linda Reynolds spoke about forgiveness, about how Sarah had never stopped caring about the case, never stopped trying to find answers. "She was a good investigator and a good person," Linda said. "And she finally got to see justice done before she passed. That's more than many people get." The case of the missing pilots became a cautionary tale, taught in FBI training programs as an example of how evidence can be manipulated, how criminals can hide in plain sight, how sometimes the answer is right in front of you but carefully concealed. It's used in airline security training, in corporate ethics courses, in criminal justice programs across the country. But beyond the training materials and the case studies and the memorial plaques, the story is about two men. Two ordinary men who got up one September morning in 1987, kissed their loved ones goodbye, and went to work. Two men who did their jobs with integrity and honor. Two men who paid the ultimate price for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, for overhearing something they shouldn't have, for being seen as obstacles to greed. Michael Reynolds, who coached Little League and never missed his kids' school events, who loved his wife and dreamed of retiring to a cabin in Wisconsin where he could fish and read and watch his grandchildren grow up. He never got to see his children graduate from high school or college. Never walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. Never held his first grandchild. All of that was stolen from him by two men who valued money more than human life. David Chen, who was supposed to get married in the spring of 1988, who'd planned to have 4 children with Jennifer Morrison, who wanted to eventually become a captain and maybe one day train new pilots. He never got to say, "I do." Never got to buy his first house or celebrate his first anniversary or any of the thousands of small moments that make up a life. All of that was taken from him because he heard the wrong conversation at the wrong time. Their story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the persistence of truth, to the fact that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, will eventually come to light. It took 36 years, but justice finally found its way through the darkness, through the brick, through the decades of lies and cover-ups. And perhaps that's the real lesson of this terrible story. That truth cannot be permanently sealed away. That justice, though sometimes delayed beyond reason, beyond endurance, will eventually break through. That the scratch marks on a brick wall, the desperate final words written on a torn piece of paper, the love of families who never gave up, all of these things have a power that outlasts greed, outlasts death, outlasts even time itself. Michael Reynolds and David Chen deserved to come home that September day in 1987. They deserved to live their lives, to see their dreams realized, to grow old with the people they loved. They deserved so much more than they got. But in the end, their story was told. Their names were cleared. Their sacrifices were honored. And the men who murdered them faced justice, even if it came 36 years too late. May they both rest in peace. May their families find comfort in finally knowing the truth. And may we never forget that behind every unsolved mystery, there are real people whose stories deserve to be told, whose lives matter, whose memories deserve to be honored. Blue skies and tailwinds, Captain Reynolds. Blue skies and tailwinds, First Officer Chen. Your final flight is over. You're finally home. The case of the missing pilots reminds us why these stories matter, why we can never stop searching for truth no matter how much time has passed, why we owe it to victims and their families to never give up. Every cold case represents lives interrupted, families left in limbo, justice denied. But sometimes, just sometimes, the truth finds its way to the surface. If this story moved you, if you found yourself on the edge of your seat waiting to see how it ended, then I've done my job. These are the kinds of stories we tell here on Ultimate Crime Stories. Deep dives into mysteries that captivate us, that make us think, that remind us of the fragility of life and the importance of truth. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. We've got dozens more mysteries to explore, stories that will keep you up at night, cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this case. Did it surprise you? Were you shocked by the revelation? What would you like to see covered next? And remember, somewhere out there, there's another sealed wall hiding another terrible secret. Another family waiting for answers. Another mystery waiting to be solved. The question is, will we be there when the wall finally comes down? Thank you for watching Ultimate Crime Stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop searching for the truth.